Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Chicago Justice Podcast. We have a great show for you today. Today, we feature an interview with Jodi Cohen, who is a reporter at Publica, where she focuses on stories about schools and juvenile justice, and Jennifer Smith Richards, who is a reporter with the Chicago Tribune, a member of the Publica Distinguished Fellows Program. What are we talking about? We're talking about their phenomenal story and stories, because it's had follow-ups. The price kids pay. Schools and police punish students with costly tickets for minor misbehavior. The crux of this story, ladies and gentlemen, is that as of, I think, 2015, if I'm not mistaken, schools cannot ticket kids for misbehavior. And so what did they do? They basically give that, instead of writing the tickets themselves, they give the information they get, and they give it to the school resource officers, also known as the cop in the school. That's a problem all by itself. And they write the tickets. Disgusting, horrible process. We're going to talk all about it with Jodi and Jennifer in a minute. But first, I want to talk to you about CJP's got our 15th anniversary fundraiser going. Go to chicagojustice.org, upper right-hand corner. Click on donate. Drop us a line of any of our social medias. Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and we will get you hooked up if you're interested in helping us fundraise. $100 if you want to help us raise $100, $500, $1,000, anything. We will get you set up. We can even personalize a fundraising page just for you. So if you're interested, let us know. Okay, with that, I'm just going to jump into this interview. It's really, really amazing reporting. There will be, if you're watching this on YouTube, the links in the description for the reporting. And if you are getting this through the podcasting world, you can go to the post on our page in the news section, and there will be links to all the stories there. Okay, I'll be back with you in a little bit after the interview. All right, welcome to the Chicago Justice Podcast. Today, I am honored to have Jodi Cohen from ProPublica, who's a reporter there that focuses on stories about schools and juvenile justice, and Jennifer Smith Richards, a reporter to Chicago Tribune and also a member of the ProPublica Distinguished Fellows Program. Ladies, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for having us on.
Yeah, thanks.
So we're going to talk about a story that, wow, if this isn't Pulitzer work, the price kids pay. Schools and police punish students with costly tickets for minor misbehavior. Runaway, I have this phrase that I use, which is function creep. And to conservatives, I think it's about, they always think about restraining government, but they never think about restraining the criminal justice system. I look at it from a point like, no matter how good you think a tactic or a power that you're going to give the criminal justice system is, it always has to be restrained. Because while it may work in this one small niche situation, if you allow it to creep into other things, it will, because it just always will. It always creeps into situations where we don't want things to be. And I don't know if they should ever be ticketing students, but we're going to get into this because some of the things they're ticketed for and the impact on kids is just disgusting. All right. And I'm just going to tell you my feelings the whole way through this, which are just really, really bad, although the work is great. All right, Jodi, I'm going to start with you. Without giving away your sources, if you can kind of give my audience a little bit of idea of how you came onto this story.
Definitely. So Jennifer and I, a few years ago, wrote a series of stories called The Quiet Rooms. It was about schools using seclusion and restraint on children in Illinois schools. So seclusion being putting children in locked spaces alone, and restraint being, holding kids physically down. And while in the process of doing that investigation, we saw many reports where police were routinely involved with school behavior. And we published The Quiet Rooms and kind of just put a pin in these thoughts about like how are police involved in schools. Of course, you hear when there's like a big incident in the news, there's an arrest of a young student at school, or something that rises to like a major event. But we were really interested in the more day-to-day interactions. So we decided to send some public records requests to school districts to see what happens when police get involved with school incidents. And we started getting documents back that referred to citations or tickets. And these are tickets for violating local laws, violating municipal ordinances. And we decided to try to learn as much as we could about that. And that was the very beginning of how we started working on the investigation on school ticketing in Illinois.
Okay, Jennifer, can you give us an idea how many school districts, because I think you did this throughout the state, how many school districts were you able to gather data on, and how persistent, or persistent isn't the word, prevalent is this practice throughout the state? Do we have an idea?
Yeah, so we looked into about 200 school districts. We targeted Illinois school districts. As you know, they have their high school districts, elementary districts, and then what are called unit districts, which are K-12. So we focused initially on high school districts, and we looked into large unit districts that were operating high schools. So those are the kind of Urbana, Rockford, Chicago public schools. So we looked at a really large number of school districts and found that most of them had some sort of ticketing going on. We saw that there were definitely patterns of places that very much were committed to issuing tickets for student behavior, and places where it was a little more rare. But we're talking many school districts that were using this practice. It was not at all uncommon across urban, rural, suburban settings.
Frustrating. Same frustrating after every answer. So Jodi, why, if I remember going through your story correctly, school districts, the schools themselves seem to be prohibited from fining students, but the cops aren't. Can you explain to us the nuance that's going on there?
Illinois law back in 2015, Illinois passed a very broad school discipline overhaul bill called SB 100. And the idea was to keep students in school. So try to reduce expulsions and also just really focus on positive behavior intervention as instead of punishment. So one part of that bill, or one part of that law says that schools cannot issue fines as discipline. So, if there is a student doing something, the school dean can't give them a fine. But what we found was happening is that there would be something happening at school. A dean would think that they saw a vape pen, or there would be, a fight in the hallway, and the school dean, the school administrator would give the information to the school police officer, the school resource officer who's stationed at the school through agreements between the towns and the schools. And the police officer would take the information from the school administrator and use that to write a student a ticket, which almost always comes with a fine. And that was what was happening. So the students aren't being fined by the school, they're being fined by the police with information provided by the schools.
In the school, they're being fined for something they do in the school. Okay, another reason to get SROs out of schools. All right, I'm sorry, go ahead, Jodi.
I was gonna say there's another law that was passed a couple years after the law I was just referring to that dealt specifically with truancy. And that law says that schools cannot refer students to another authority like police in order to get fined for truancy. So that is completely illegal. And we found dozens of school districts that were still telling the police about truant students, and those students were then fined.
We're going to get to an example of that. Once again, this is why when you put people who think writing public policy is easy, it's very hard to write public policy that restrains the behavior of humans and gets them to act in the way you want them to. One would hope they would adjust that bill and make it $100,000 fine for the school and the administrator that does it for every ticket that is written from one of their on one of their students. I think that would probably change the behavior of these school administrators. So I'm going to go back to you, Jennifer, but I want to read a little bit from the article and give a couple examples of some of the fines here for our audience. So the Tazewell, if I'm pronouncing that well, County Courthouse, 30 students, not for crimes, but for tickets. Students were given a choice: agree to pay or fight the ticket at a later hearing. Students were warned failing to pay, they were told, could bring adult consequences, from losing their driving privileges to harming their future credit scores. And here's some examples of the tickets. Here's just 3 of them. Please, I'm going to have links to all the stories they have written. Please go read them. We could talk all day about all the examples. 14-year-old Abigail, $200 for truancy, even though it's against the law for them to write the ticket. 14-year-old Sophia, $175 for possessing a vape pen. 12-year-old Cameron, if I'm pronouncing that right, $250 fines and fees for shoving a friend. What were your thoughts when you started seeing these tickets?
I think our first impression was, these offenses that we saw in Tazewell and other places were very common kind of student behavior at school. Like, everybody can identify with, somebody being caught smoking in the locker room, or, a fight or shoving match breaks out in the hallway, or, students skipping a class they don't like. So we identified with those behaviors right away as typical school behaviors that previously, you expect would end up with detention, or with a fight, potentially suspension. But these were things that we discovered pretty quickly were, again, very common student behaviors, but very commonly being ticketed, and the student was still being disciplined by the school. So these are behaviors that once would have resulted just in detention, for example, and now resulted in detention and a $200 fine and a visit to the courthouse, where you have to go before a hearing officer or judge.
One of the things that I don't think people understand is that anytime you increase the amount that anyone, let alone a juvenile of color and poor, every time you increase interaction with the criminal justice system, you're increasing the likelihood that you're going to have a negative outcome because of an outburst of the student, or misunderstanding, or some bad actions by the justice system that could lead to much, much more serious crimes than having a vape pen. We see it with traffic stops, where the original traffic stop is for nothing, but it escalates and someone gets shot. I don't understand why schools have just given their authority over handling these things to the police. So I'm going to go back to you, Jodi, because there's a part in here, a phrase in here about assembly line hearings. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about more about that, because that phrase existing when you're talking about these events, to me, is horrible and horrific. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, I also, something you just said, I wanted to mention something you said, handing this over to the police. And we talked to police, authority, law enforcement authorities, who don't like this. I mean, they don't want this to be their job either, to be handling school discipline matters. There was one school district where, since the story published, has decided to stop involving police, and the police chief there is thrilled. Like, this isn't, what they want to be doing either. But in terms of the assembly line hearings, so the way these work is, imagine, you get a ticket as an adult, and you don't believe it was just, or, you want to fight against the ticket. You go to a hearing to deal with that ticket. It's the same thing for juveniles, for students and other kids. Sometimes they don't have a choice, they have to go. And they show up, and because these are systems meant for adults, not for kids, they don't have any right to an attorney. They often don't really understand what's going on. It's intimidating. Many of these hearings that are held in police stations or in City Hall are made to look like courtrooms. So the hearing officer will be sitting up, on higher up, and there's a podium, and it's just it's this courtroom-like setting without really any of the rights that you have in juvenile court. And the students are just kind of processed. That's why it's like assembly line. Like, you go up, sometimes they ask for your plea, the hearing officer, sometimes they don't. You just, that you almost never win. We have some data from two places in the story that show like the chance of actually, getting out of the ticket is almost impossible. So it's just this very, line up, process, move on kind of system. But it's a system that comes with, big fines and harm to, students and their families.
Okay. God, that's so disgusting. It reminds me a little bit. I'm not sure if you've seen the documentary out of in Philadelphia, I believe it was, or area of Philadelphia. Pennsylvania. It wasn't in Philly, but it was an area of Pennsylvania called. And there's a documentary called Cash for Kids, and it was about basically incarcerating kids into a new juvenile detention center. And there was allegations that the judges got kickbacks, but it was similar. Like, kids would yell at their grandfather, and the grandfather called the cops to quiet down the kid, and the cops arrest the kid, and the kid goes to juvie for 6 months. But it's very similar in the fact of how the kids had no idea what was going on in court. And for the simplest things, they were getting incarcerated. So in that,
Yes, I remember those stories.
Okay.
For sure.
And in my thinking with that, the allegation, I don't think it was actually proved out when you watch the documentary. It was all about kickbacks and money. And I don't think it is. I just think it was two judges, or one specific judge, who was so far right wing that he thought if you did anything on the line, you should be incarcerated. I don't necessarily think they proved out the money and kickback scheme, but it made me think, which is why I'm going to ask you, Jennifer, this question. How much of this, is there some element to this where this is small towns or cities or whatever benefiting by collecting? Is this a revenue generating scheme to some extent?
So that's a really good question, a really interesting question. We did not find that there was any financial benefit to schools, for example, to allow police to write tickets to students for their behavior. But the money goes to municipalities. And while most of the money that municipalities are raising through this process actually goes to fund the process itself, like to pay the hearing officer, to pay the person who might be acting as a clerk or a bailiff, for the facility. So we didn't find examples of this being like a huge revenue generator. But certainly student ticketing in some communities was a huge part of their overall ticketing system. So we found communities where, like, the high school and the junior high were the most ticketed locations in the entire city for police issued tickets, not things like parking or housing code violations, but for police issued tickets. So yeah, like, student ticketing was a huge part of ticketing in some communities. But we did not find examples where, the community was financially really, really benefiting from the ticketing. That's not to say that it wasn't an important part of their system, but it didn't seem to be like, an oversized benefit.
Okay, so hey, Jodi.
We did find
okay.
also, I think this is interesting, that the it does seem like the fees that are attached to these and the fines are paying for the system to, for the hearing officer, for the prosecutor to show up, for to the clerks to show up. So yesterday I was at a hearing where there were cases that were dismissed or they didn't charge the fines, but yet they still made the people pay the $55 court fee, even though it wasn't in court. And the hearing officer even said, I need you to pay this fee because look, the police officer is here and I'm here. And we have, you know, just showing that this is paying for the system that's, you know, that these towns have.
So we're gonna, that's good. So we're gonna dismiss the charge. We didn't find you guilty of doing this. We found you not, essentially not guilty, or we're not gonna pursue it. But since, you know, we're all here, why don't you just, you know, hand over $55 because, you know, you had the pleasure of coming. Someone's got to pay my salary.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah, and $55 is actually not even close to the highest fee that we saw in places. So if your community processes these tickets through the actual circuit court system, which, you know, they can do instead of holding their own local hearing, that's an automatic $100 court fee. Right. I mean, it becomes immediately very expensive for families.
Yeah, because all right, I'm gonna save that because here's my next question. I guess I'll go to you, Jodi, with it. Are there disparities in the schools that ticket, in the individuals that get these tickets? Is there some disparities that we need to know about in the system?
So as Jennifer said earlier, the ticketing is happening across the state, except not in Chicago. So we didn't find any tickets in being issued at Chicago Public Schools. But in terms of geographic, we did not see, you know, only one area of the state. We saw it pretty spread out, although there were pockets. So we did find, like, in certain counties, there would be, you know, the surrounding communities all kind of had the same system and did things the same way and ticketed a lot. We did find disparities by race in who is being ticketed. So the ticketing, some disparities with, you know, Black students in some school districts being ticketed at higher rates than the student population at those schools. And we did a story that really focused on that looked at the disparities by race.
In the justice system in Illinois specifically, but in this country, there's almost always, if you dig deep enough, a disparity to be found, unfortunately. Okay, I'm going to go to you, Jennifer, but I want to read I think a quote of sorts from Kip Heinley, if that's how you pronounce his name. Kip, if I'm mispronouncing it, I apologize. Spokesman for the Illinois School Resource Officers Association, because in Illinois, everything has an association. So cops that are in schools have an association. Said that he thinks ticketing is uncommon in the district he works. But I think your story proved that to be a little less than on the mark.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there is widely a belief, even among people who work in schools and work close to policing in schools, that this is an uncommon practice. It is not. I mean, we looked over 3 school years and were able to document close to 12,000 tickets issued to kids. There definitely are places in the state where it's very common to get a ticket. All the kids know it's possible to get a ticket. You know, kids will get ticketed for truancy, and then, you know that there's going to be a fine. It's much more common than that officer believed that it was. And I think that, you know, this is a practice that gets kind of embedded in the school culture. Mm-hmm. And so it just doesn't strike anybody as unusual, really, or notable.
That's, once again, we've talked about that already. It's just that by itself, it just becomes institutionalized. And everyone just thinks it's how it should be is a problem. Okay, we're going to talk a little more in depth here. And my next question to you, Jodi, is about truancy. I'm going to read a little bit from the article. The investigation also found the police had issued more than 1,800 tickets for truancy across at least 40 municipalities. More than 1,000 of those tickets were issued after January 1, 2019, when what happened? A state law went into effect prohibiting schools from notifying authorities about truant students so police can ticket them. 1,000. That's not one school making a mistake. That's it being institutionalized. So what is there a punishment for these schools that issue tickets that were against state law?
Well, that's a good question. I do not know of any punishment that's being given to schools that were referring students to police. I think that since the story ran, some have stopped. I think there were some places that perhaps not know about the law, others that just kept doing it anyway. One thing to keep in mind is the story covered the years 2018 to 2021, but during a lot of that time, of course, schools were closed due to the pandemic. So the numbers are lower than they might have been otherwise. So you think about like truancy tickets, were not, there was a period of time where no students were going physically to school. But in terms of your question about punishment, I don't know that there's been any repercussions for schools that, where students were being ticketed. One thing that did happen is some towns were referring where the families, the students were not paying the tickets, where the debts, there were debts. The towns were using a state collections program called the local debt relief recovery program, which uses the state comptroller's office to collect wages or garnish tax refunds. And the state has said that they will not do that for truancy tickets because those tickets should not be issued at all. They're illegal. Yes.
The laws that govern, disciplinary fines for kids had no enforcement mechanism in them, right? So there's no consequence to the school for participating in this system. And the laws themselves, as you mentioned at the top, they govern the schools and not police. So enforcement and consequences for running afoul of the law simply don't exist.
Yeah, and there's two steps to this. I've spent a lot of my life working on police accountability issues, but let's talk about, you can't. Well, a couple things is they're not even punishing the institution. So every time they write an illegal ticket, maybe there's $100,000 fine and escalates as it goes up. They're going to stop writing those tickets. But you also have to go after the individuals, right? The administrators within the schools that are taking this to the police have to have some accountability in this. It can't just be an institution itself, because then there's, for the most part, no motivation for the individual actors to stop doing what they're doing. And certainly the police accountability system, one would think, although when you get the Chicago one doesn't work. I can't imagine going into smaller towns what that's like. But one would think writing an illegal ticket to some person in the city or state by itself would be enough to get you fired when you purposely break the law. But obviously the state legislature needs to write in some they need to write in some consequences for those that do this. I mean, what you see, and it frustrates me as a criminologist and criminal justice system, so many people of color in jail for like possession of drugs or selling a small amounts of drugs. And yet these people are writing hundreds, if not 1,000, or probably 1,500, 2,000 tickets probably would have been what they did as kids were in school the whole time, and nothing, they all know it's illegal and nothing happens. It's very frustrating to me. So can you give us an idea? I guess I'll go to you, Jennifer. Can you give us an idea what happens? I think you reported on some of this. Real life, kid gets a fine, a ticket for the vape pen, let's say, and it's $150, $175. If they don't pay, if they can't afford to pay, what happens?
Right. I mean, the key here is like, if they can't afford to pay, like these are, just to remind listeners, like these are kids and many of them don't have a source of income, right? So these tickets get issued to the children. The children are responsible for paying them. If they don't pay, they can't pay. Many communities offer a payment plan. And so kids can get on a payment plan to pay, 5, 10, 15, whatever, dollars per month for some number of months. If they still don't pay, even after trying to break that down into small chunks, the communities can take them to collections, and many do. So we found many communities that will try to shift that financial responsibility to the parent, right, who would sign up with the kid at the time of the payment plan, and they will send those parents to collections for the tickets. We found some communities that will wait until the student turns 18 and then send the student to collections. And as Jodi mentioned, we found some communities that send these unpaid fines and fees through to the state, basically like the state local collections arm of the comptroller's office. So then that debt is sitting there with the state for when the kid does have some sort of source of income, they could potentially garnish that tax refund. So there are financial consequences. You can absolutely see records of kids being in collections specifically because they didn't pay their e-cigarette or truancy fines.
Astounding. It's an entire system set up with the state and private industry to go after and collect this money. Okay, I'm going to get you out of here on this last question. I guess I'll go to Jodi with this one. What we talked a little bit about it. What has been the fallout from your stories?
Well, the within the day the story ran, it was published in the morning. That night, state school superintendent Ayala sent out an email, a message to all stakeholders, all school officials, people in education in Illinois, that said basically cut this out. Stop telling police about school behavior issues so students get ticketed. This is doing nothing to help students. It's hurting families. It doesn't work. If you're trying to change behavior, this is not the way to do it. It was a very, really an emotional letter that was begging people to stop doing this. That was one thing that happened right away. There were some lawmakers, including Speaker Welch, who said they want to revisit the laws and see what they can do to stop this through the legislature. As we talked about, the state comptroller's office is not going to collect on truancy debt anymore. What else? Schools said some schools have stopped referring students to police. They've said that. I think those are the big ones. But one thing to mention is that there is no tracking of this. So like your suggestion to, every time a ticket is issued illegally, to find that those authorities $100,000. This is really under the radar in a lot of ways. I mean, the education department, the U.S. Department of Education, tracks student arrests at school through data and referrals to law enforcement, which could include students who get ticketed, but there's no really separate tracking just of students who get ticketed at school. So we did it on really a town by town basis, school by school basis, but there's no central way. Certainly the state of Illinois isn't doing it. So if the state wanted, a full picture of students who get police tickets at school, there is no, other than our database, which we made public. I encourage your listeners to go look up the schools that they're interested in, see all the data we collected, but there is no other place to really have a full understanding of how broad of an issue this is in Illinois schools.
Well, the work is phenomenal. And the problem without your work, the problem would just keep getting worse and worse. Like the function creep part of this, if it's not restrained, it will just keep getting worse. All right. So the story again, ladies and gentlemen, at least the main story, is the price kids pay. Schools and police punish students with costly tickets for minor misbehavior. Jodi Cohen from Publica and Jennifer Smith Richards from the Chicago Tribune. Thank you so much for taking the time. And once again, awesome story.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, we are back. I'd like to thank Jodi Cohen from Publica and Jennifer Smith Richards from the Chicago Tribune. I want to thank them for their awesome reporting. I want to thank them for sitting down with us to chat about their amazing set of stories. It's really, the process is disgusting, right? It's disgusting. When and why, and maybe I have a friend who probably knows about this. Maybe I'll do an interview with her about it, but I'm really curious about where schools gave up their authority to discipline kids. Did it happen after Columbine? Was that it? And the zero tolerance? What happened? I can't imagine. I'm 51 actually. I can't imagine growing up where you had to worry about getting tickets and coming home with $150, $200, $300, $500 fines for misbehavior in schools. It's just ridiculous. On a criminal justice note, as I said in the interview, we need to do everything we can as a society to reduce the interactions, the public and our youth, especially the youth of color and poor youth. And that usually goes hand in hand with youth of color and being poor in this country because of all the racism and segregation. We need to reduce the interactions the public has with the police. We especially need to go to those targeted groups and significantly reduce the interactions those groups have with the police. Why? Are the police inherently bad? We could talk about that. At times they certainly are, at times they're not. But anytime you interact with the police or law enforcement or officials in the justice system, there is the possibility that that interaction, for reasons because of the police and reasons because of the individual interacting with the police and how they handle that interaction, there is the chance for it to go bad. And whether that's pushing a police officer, resisting the ticket, yelling at a judge, pushing a judge or a prosecutor or an official, anytime as you ratchet up the number of those interactions, there's going to be more and more of those. Not a greater percentage, but even in the same percentage, you have more, the percentage stays the same, but you have more, you're going to have more of the positive or more of the regular, you're going to have more of the negative. With it, those interactions going bad and leading to like really serious, serious misdemeanor or felony charges for like having a vape pen in school. It's monstrous. It's stupid. But of course, we have such a inept, incompetent, not all of them, but many of them in our General Assembly. In 2019, it went in, as I think, either Jodi or Jennifer said, in 2019, this new bill went into place outlawing tickets for truancy. So what does the schools around the state do? They write 1,000 more tickets over a couple of years. Some of that time was during pandemic time. So there would actually have been more than 1,000 if there wasn't the pandemic, because there were so few kids in schools around the state for months on end. Those are 1,000 illegal tickets. No consequences for the cops who wrote them, no consequences for the supervisors that accepted them, no consequences for the hearing officer or the city officials, no consequences for the administrators in the schools that were doing it. All of their actions were all illegal. No consequences. But there's consequences for the person carrying the vape pen or skipping school. Listen, we need teeth in these things that outlaw things. Not teeth in bills that punish poor, underserved communities and the people that live in them, but consequences for the people in power. How about anytime you write one of these tickets, it's a $10,000 fine against the administrator or school official that brought the information to the cop and to the cop, and $100,000 to the police department and to the school. And that ratchets up. Every next offense, that amount doubles. Let's see if they stop writing those tickets. What do you think? Think they're going to stop writing them? Obviously, counting them to just do the goddamn right thing ain't working. It just isn't working. The schools around the state wrote 1,000 truancy tickets from January 1 of 19, I think, through the end of 21. Of those 36 months, what? 14, 18 of them, they weren't in school, 20, right? Just because, did they miss all of the fall of 20 and the spring of 21, may have not been in school at all at that time? I mean, they missed months and months of school and they still had 1,000 tickets. It's ridiculous. Thank you again to Jodi and Jennifer. Awesome, awesome reporting. That has had an impact, as we talked about during the interview. It's had an impact, and hopefully it'll continue to have an impact. We'll just see. All right, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for tuning in. I will see you next week, hopefully. All right, take it easy.